Good morning. I'm glad you're all here. Yes, this is a session on new stuff in ASP.NET Core. It focuses mostly on minimal web APIs, but minimal web APIs is about a lot more than just that particular part. And I took the liberty to pick up some things of .NET 8 as well. So it covers 6, 7, and 8, and all the things that are new in there. Um, so just out of interest, has anyone looked at minimal web APIs already? Couple of hands. All right. So yes. Well, the agenda, I thought, okay, let's do this minimal thing and show it. And we could explain this in like a few minutes, and then you're like, okay, well, this is not too difficult. Probably by reading it, you're already like, okay, I can see what this is doing. But there's a lot under the covers, and that's the main goal for today, to see what is going on behind the scenes. What does this actually mean? And what if it becomes a little bit more serious than just an hello world? So that's at the end of the session. I hope that you will say, okay, this was the basics, but I know what is going on in between those lines. Now, Microsoft has this, if you've been programming ASP.NET Core for a while, you know that there's the MVC model, there's Razor Pages, there's the pipelines, all these things that are there. But still, they got inspired by a few frameworks. And what these frameworks do is they have much less ceremony to get things going. And this is one that's been around for the .NET framework for a while. It's Nancy FX, or the Nancy framework, and it uses modules. But if you look, then you can see this thing that will be recurring over and over again. It takes a route and it does something. So that's an expression or a lambda that says, okay, if you hit this route, do this. And this is the .NET world. But if you go to F#, for example, you see similar things. You have some routing, and you have some actions that are executed. In Node.js, they can do that as well. Just say, okay, this is the thing that I want to do, and then just start hosting it and listening to the incoming requests. So it's very minimalistic, and this is enough to get you going. So why would it need to? What does it need to be so difficult with all the things that we see in C# and .NET? And this is one where there's even a little bit of actual thing in there. You see that there's a get for the all scores, and then you can, if you can get to the data, you can just stream that back as a response. So all these things are, inspirational for the team that said, okay, we want to offer people that have been in this area, we want to offer them as a gateway into the .NET world, so they can do these things, and there's a growth model. So if you try to create the minimalistic thing in ASP.NET Core, even before .NET 6, this is what you could do. The console read key is just to pause the application there, so it's a single line to get you going. Map a route to some action. But the action that you have, it's a specific signature, and it's very raw and basic. So just the incoming request, the outgoing response, and some data that is retrieved from somewhere. And it does things, but it's very awkward. It's not really productive. You need to do things all by hand and by yourself. But then came .NET 6, 7, or 8. And just to get a bit of a feeling in the crowd, raise your hand if you're on .NET 6. 7? All right, okay. And who's looking into 8? 3 people, okay, or maybe a bit more. Well, yeah, so the .NET 8 will be here in November, so it's already on preview 4, pretty new, and we'll show what is in this things here. But first, let's have a quick look at the demos that we have. So first of all, let's do a bit of inspection of what the original model is. So if you have something like some implementation, well, you could, for example, you could create a leaderboard controller. This is the old world, right? As you can see, you use a lot of metadata to annotate the behavior of your controllers for APIs, and then you can do things like injection into the constructors of your controllers, and you start mapping out the individual actions that are there. And these are, they indicate the route. So in this case, it's just a plain get to the root. and it uses some convention to get to this particular method, and then you execute your logic. The logic, it uses Entity Framework Core to retrieve some scores, and it serializes them as this new high score thing, which is this DTO here at the top, a game and nickname endpoints. So that's what we'll be using as an example. The startup traditionally was something like this. So you did in your main entry point, you would have this host builder, and the host builder would do stuff for you. It usually did this create default builder, and I'm dropping out these things. These are all the things that it does for you. So it wires up the application with logging, with configuration settings, and it gets you going. And then you can do some additional configuration of logging, web host defaults, application settings, and application configuration, just to bootstrap the application. And here it uses a startup type as well, because in the startup we do the final things, which are essentially two things: configuring the services for dependency injection and configuring the application itself. And because this is an ASP.NET Core application, it's mostly about routing, middleware, and endpoints. So you see this use endpoints where we can map individual endpoints, and the other endpoints come from the controllers. So you can do things right here, or you can say I've got them in the controller implementation. So this is important to know, because this is what we'll be migrating from later on, but this is also, you know, to get a good feeling of what does this look like when we are entering this minimal web API and a new style of hosting ASP.NET Core applications. So if you go and do file new project and say, okay, I want to use a minimal web API new style on .NET 8, you'll get this. You'll get this thing. So it's pretty compact. It's just program CS. You don't see your static entry point main anymore, and it uses this web application thing, and it says create builder, or new is in .NET 8 is create slim builder. Then apparently you build this thing, you get an app, and in the app you do the map get, and this is kind of what we were looking at before, really compact, mapping the gets directly to the application, and then just say run. And that's it to get us going. So that spins up everything. You can do things like these. Well, let's give this a spin. All right, set a startup project and go. All right, so that's a nice start. Let's see if we can figure this out. It's not really relevant for now. Yeah, we'll try again, but it's probably going to crash again. All right, let's skip that one. All right. So that's what we get from the thing. So what the team said is we'll provide this new model, but it's not going to be a replacement. So it's going to exist side by side. It has all these things where you can do modern endpoints. There's some overloads for route handlers that we'll be looking at, and it's focused on APIs. So it's not intended to build web pages with HTML support. That's probably still going to be Razor pages. It might appear in the future, but it's for now it's just focusing purely on the API side. So if you want to build the old MVC style things with controllers, that's still doable. And you'll see that there's this thing where the new inventions that they make on the minimal side will get ported into the controller side, and vice versa. So you'll see new things appearing on both sides, but in different appearances. There's also a new hosting model. The hosting model is like something slightly different from the generic host and the web host. That's what you had for hosting services that do not have a web component, and web host is for ASP.NET Core things. This new hosting model, and you saw that just a little bit ago with the web application, can be used by other things, such as hosted services, the gRPC, or and also even the WASM space can make use of that. And all in all, the new style is about expressiveness. It should be more convenient, easier to get things going. And it uses a lot of things from C# 9, 10, and 11 to make it more compact. And we'll cover those as well. But first, let's have a look at this start where it says Web Application Create Builder or the Create Slim Builder. This is where it's important to understand that if you start your application, you want to host your logic. And a lot of things happen under the covers to get this up in the air. The generic host with the iHost Builder implementation allows you to set up things like the configuration for the host and all the things for the dependency injection just to get you going. And if you did a worker service, then you would probably do something like add hosted service with the generic of your type. That would be enough. And if you are hosting on the web with some HTTP handling or gRPC handling, you would do the web host side as well. So there's additional things, more dependency injection that's getting registered. You have that startup class that does the configure services and configure, where configure is the part where you do your mapping and your routing and adding all the middleware for the middleware pipeline, and that's specific to web hosting. If you look at the way that the .NET 6 and onwards application is getting bootstrapped, it starts with this this Create Builder. There's also a newer way in .NET 8 to do the same thing for the hosted services, because the hosted services in 6 and 7 did the old model that we saw with the configure logging and configure application settings. But the new way to use this web application builder is that it gives you access to the configuration, the dependency injection services, and everything surrounding your host, whether it's the underlying host, the generic host, or the web host. And then you have other things for the startup and configuration, and you do your mapping. And the mapping is an important part of the application setting or startup in the new minimal way. And finally you end your file with the app.run, and that will start running your application and hosting and waits for shutdown. So that's the starting point. Now let's have a look at the request handling. It's kind of similar to how it's always been. There's an HTTP endpoint you want to expose, and then you have your middleware pipeline. That's an ordered list of implementation that pass on to each other like a chain, and it passes through it on the way in, where it finds out, okay, which endpoint should I reach? Some middleware will shortcut things and just send a response back without hitting any endpoints. For example, the authorization middleware, if you're not authorized and it notices it, it doesn't execute the endpoint. It just straight sends back a 401 unauthorized, so you don't even reach the endpoints. But let's say that the middleware is all okay, and you go to the define endpoints, and then finally you want to execute the endpoint logic that's behind the endpoints. So this incoming request, it's a particular verb. It has a URL, so it does some pattern matching on the URL, and it has a payload in the body, for example. So the middleware eventually will find out this is the endpoint that we need to go to, and the endpoint dispatches it to the endpoint logic. And well, this route endpoint is a definition that says, okay, these are the path segments, and you can do placeholders there, so you can extract the information from that from those segments. You can have parameters like query string parameters, and you have well, some inbound and outbound precedents of the endpoints, which might be relevant in the registration. And then finally, to create your endpoint logic, there's a lot of choice. So you can do the one that says delegates and lambdas. That's the one that we'll be focusing on. but all the other ones still apply. So you can do an MVC controller action. You can have a middleware that takes care of this endpoint, so it might be more visualized on the left side. And there's the razor pages and other means of saying, okay, if you hit this endpoint, this is what you should return as a response. Now, looking at the pipelines and the middleware, you have this set of endpoints that you need to define. If you use create builder, it will register two things by default. So the host filtering and the developer exception page in case you're doing a hosting from a development environment. So that's an environmental setting that you can override, but by default it's assumed, and then the developer exception page comes in. Then if you start using or defining the middleware, so this after building the web application builder, you do build, you get this web application thing, but it exposes an endpoint route builder, and this endpoint route builder is your gateway into saying, okay, these are the endpoints that I want to have, and these are the middleware modules that I want to register. So I just took two arbitrary ones, use course and use directory browser, and they will get registered as part of this area that is the responsibility of the application builder. Now, as soon as you map some endpoints and you have a Lambda expression there, it will create this middleware that's at the top, that's endpoint routing. So it knows it needs it, and it will be registered kind of by itself by doing the first time you register a route. Now, that should be enough. Now, you might find that in your current implementation that do not use minimal APIs, you already have this thing called use routing. But if you do, essentially you're saying, I want to be in control of the routing, and since I put it underneath use directory browser, I'm changing the order. So they let you change the place where this endpoint routing is registered, and it might be relevant in this order. And then finally, we saw in the original one that we had this thing called use endpoints, and then we can start using endpoints inside this registration. So that means that you get another endpoint middleware as part of the area where the application builder is doing things. Now, that is not really necessary anymore. So the tip would be, you don't need to call endpoint routing. You can skip the use endpoints, because what's inside there, if you imagine just this endpoints.mapget, can just be replaced with app.mapget. All right. So looking at some of the options that we can do, we have the controllers that we saw. So there's a lot of metadata in there. We have constructor injection. So we saw this part. Then if you do the plain custom middleware, the plain custom middleware, you can use this context response and do the writing by yourself. Okay. And then the final part is mapping of the endpoints. So if you start doing this, you will find that you can do the methods at the end. They replace the use of the attributes. So before minimal APIs, you had this request delegate. Excuse me. So these use endpoints, you can do this is the way you would wrap it up at the beginning, but there's this new method that takes a delegate instead of a request delegate. So the request delegate had this HTTP context that it give you access to that, but the new one, the delegate, doesn't require any specific signature. So that gives you a lot of new options, and the mapping that you get with this delegate, there's a lot of magic going on. So with this magic, there's all these things that happen inside of a map post. So for example, the endpoint route builder that is exposed on the web application, it has the additional overloads for mapget, map post, other things, and it inspects the signature of your method. So in this case, there's the new delegate type. Inside of the delegate, it looks at the various things that are there. So for example, you we'll be looking at it in a moment, but you have the high score entry, which is some payload data. You have the high score repository, which is an injected thing, and the cancellation token and claims principle are things that are known. ID is something that is mapped from the route. So you see that this signature is getting all the information. It knows what it needs to do, and you can be very explicit in some points. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Now at the bottom you see that the things with name, with tags, is a different way to specify your metadata. It would just do that in a different way, because annotating things in your delegate is kind of hard. You see that there's this authorize thing there, and this authorize is a new thing in C#. So you can take a lambda and apply attributes there. Now finally, there's the extension methods that I already mentioned, and those can get pretty long as a list. Now the delegate mapping magic, we talked about the attributes, so that's kind of what is there, the authorize. It might also be endpoint summary or other things that you encounter there. And you have the dependency injection. So for example, this high score repository, the interface has been registered before, and it will pick up those things and see, okay, this is what I can match, so I will get it from the dependency injection system. Now the from services is to be explicit, so you can be very specific. Okay, this is what I want you to get from the services. You could do that before on controller actions, because the controllers had this constructor where you could inject, but also on the action level you could specify attributes with from services. Now the way you start registering those things is no longer in the startup class, because that's no longer needed. The startup class has had this configure services where you would do your things. That has now moved to builder.services. So there you can say add scope, add singleton, add transient, so you can register your various mappings. And then if you want to change the service provider and do something different from the original one, you can do whatever other thing like autofactor and inject, Castle Windsor. You can just replace the dependency injection system there. But as you can see, it's before you start registering, and you do that at the host level. So builder, the web application builder, exposes these things such as services and host. Now some more on the delegate mapping magic. If you put things in that are known, so it's such as the HTTP related one, context, response and request, they will get picked up. In .NET 7 and onwards, you also have this form file and form file collection. You can even do streams and pipe readers, so you can take incoming streaming data. And then in particular, cancellation token, if you have long-running requests that need to be taking part in this async await with cancellation tokens. You can either pass them on, or you can check themselves for is cancellation requested. And the claims principle is about security. Now the payload data, so we had this high score entry that came from either form data, it could be from your query string, the route data, from headers, or all of these combined. You know, you can pick various things and put them together in this object, high score entry. If you want to instruct the binding mechanism to behave in a certain way, you can sort of take control by providing this method bind async. And bind async will say, okay, this is how you should do the binding. So you can make this part of your type, and it will help you to get the some influence on the way things are bound from the overarching HTTP context, which has the request and the response, and the parameter info that is being passed along. Now, if you want even more control, you can do the stuff that is new in C#11. They offer you an abstract interface. Abstract interfaces defined, abstract methods, sorry, and that are static if defined in an interface. So it's kind of strange that this interface that is usually related to implementation in a class with objects will have this static methods on the type. But it's a way that they thought, okay, especially in the new math areas of .NET 7 and 8, they found this very useful to make sure that there's, for example, something like a try parse on a certain class so it can be parsed. This is an example, but the fact that you can have abstract methods in an interface is very useful. And they will see if they can do a parse on your object and if it needs to be parsed in a special way. So for example, if you're passing data in the query string, normally it's something like an integer or a string, but let's say you have parentheses with x comma y, and x and y are integers. That thing could be parsed as a whole, and you could say, okay, this is the type that I'm getting, and it's a point, and point, the class implements this interface. Now in .NET 8 they have an additional set of analyzers, and these analyzers check things like signatures if they are okay. So for example, if you would return a task of T in this case, then you would get a warning that says, okay, this is not the correct implementation, so it's probably going to break. All right. So let's have a look at some of the implementation. So I took the original code and I started working on what it should look like in the new way. So I'll highlight a couple of things that might trip you up at the beginning. For example, do know that if this gets started by running it in debug, it will inject a couple of application options into the builder. And this is good to know because it sets, for example, these kind of things. And if you start it by hand from the command line, it's missing those things. So it will behave a little bit differently. Now the overarching thing is that first of all, you have this create builder or create slim builder, and then you start using things like services to register dependency injection things, such as API endpoints for OpenAPI with the Swagger UI. You can do health checks, and it's all part of registering things inside of the dependency injection system. You can be explicit with singletons and transient scoped elements. And some of the things like, for example, application insights or other things that you might use, those methods that would do the same thing can still work on these services, because the services is still an iService collection. You can do other things that you're used to, like adding Entity Framework Core. We're using a database here, so SQL Server, database developer page exception filter, so we will give you a little bit more details. And then finally, we will do builder.build. That means, okay, I'm done with this part. I want to have the web application, so I can configure the application part of this for the application that I'm doing now. So you can do you can access the things like the environment, because you might want to make an exception on what is used in the development space. So for example, this developer exception page won't be used in production now. Some other things for middleware, so we're using Swagger, and then we get to well, I'll focus on this thing here. We'll do the map post. Now this normally would be app.map post, but what you see that they are doing now is that they are using more and more the route groups. So that's a thing that is combined on groups, where you say, okay, we have multiple endpoints, but we combine them in a group because the group has similar things. You can use all these things like for example, require authorization, you can just say, okay, everything inside of this group requires authorization. So that will be the default. And then inside of and you have a route, the start of a route. Then finally, once you have that thing, you will say, okay, starting with /API, I can add things like scores, and then there's some parameters that are there. And you can see that with the highlighting here, it's not just a regular string, it has color inside, so it knows about the things that that are part of your route pattern, and it does the pattern matching, but it shows you the understanding. Okay, this is, I know what this string is. Then you have the attributes on your lambda, and you can specify, okay, I'm having this thing and it returns well, hopefully okay, but it might be no content, bad request, or you're not authorized. It takes something from the patterns here, so that's passed into the arguments. It takes from the body the points, and it uses this dependency injection for getting to the data with the DB context. And then we do some metadata. So we give it explicit descriptions, tell it that it needs authorization and what it accepts. So this is the new way to define such a thing. Now I did collapse the implementation because as soon as you start doing the implementation, it's your application logic. It becomes a little bit cleaner if you say, okay, we have a map get, so that's the other implementation. But I'm just saying, okay, I want to use this method get scores, and get scores is defined here. So it doesn't have to be part of this definition. You can keep those separate. And by doing it like this is kind of like an anonymous lambda. So it's hard to refer to. But this get scores, because it's a name, it can use the, it's much easier for unit testing. And then you just keep building and adding. So for example, this map post, it's an upload where it says, okay, things are coming from the form file. So it's a file from a posted form. And then it's as easy as specifying this thing and then copying it to whatever you want to do with it. So it's very convenient, and this started to appear in .NET 7. You can steer, for example, also that this is not part of the Open API description, and then it's just app.run and start running. Now, this new style of top-level statements where there's no static void main, there's no class, this is just the things that are there. This is like an important point in your code, because after this you can still define other things. So the DTO class that we had before with the high score, you could as well do that as a record struct, because it's a DTO, it's going to be immutable anyway. And you can specify with this primary constructor, these are the three properties that are there. So they will get a get and an init, and they will build everything together for you. So it's a single statement to do this class that's normally like a properties with getter and setter or private setters, and I would just conveniently record struct, and if you want you can also do record class if you want to do a bit of inheritance. Alright, so let's say this is the startup project, do play. Oh. Let's see. So this is interesting. This is the only thing I changed this morning, so let's try that again. Alright. This might be the point where we're reverting. Undo changes. Yes. Alright, let's try that again. Much better. Alright, so we're starting. It opens up the Open API stuff. We can go to the get leaderboard. We can try it out, and it will get stuff from the database. And this is as easy as it gets. So that's enough for now. All right, so let's say you have the original one and you want to start transitioning to this model because you think it's valuable to make it more compact, less ceremony. This is a breakdown of what you would need to do. So the startup class has these two specific things: configure services and configure. You can do the respective things on services and the .host property. And for the other ones, you can do the configuration, the web host, and the web application that will give you access to everything you need. Use endpoints. We already saw we need to get rid of this thing. We just take the inside and map it to the web application builder. And then all the things that were in the main methods where you said, okay, create default builder, host.create default builder, you would do configure login, configure application configuration. Those things will also need to be moved. Everything goes to builder or the endpoint route builder that comes from it. So that's this. It's almost just a lookup of things going from this one place to the other thing. Now, another important thing to note is that in the way configuration work in .NET 5, you had this configuration builder, which exposes an I configuration builder, and you would do something like add Azure Key Vault, add environment variable. So all these sources where your configuration comes from. They were all added, and finally you would do a build, and that would build something that is called the configuration root. The configuration root has a set of providers that match up to each of the sources, and they know how to read from the sources. And on a build, the providers are used to build the configuration data. And it's layered, so it adds things one after the other, overriding previous values. So you can build a really nice configuration layering. The I configuration root is I configuration, but also with access to the providers. Normally you would use the I configuration, and even better, you would map that into or bind that to objects that hold the configuration data. But the build is a thing because you are building up, and if you're going to go to Azure Key Vault, you might need to provide credentials like client ID and secret and the URL of a key vault, or it might be something else, a database that you want to connect to get some data, or Azure app configurations, or your AWS or GCP services. Usually they have some type of things, configuration, in order to get to it. But to configure it, you need to get to the configuration of that new configuration. So you need to do an intermediary build, and it's kind of a pain that you need to do build, then add some more, and then do a build again. Well, in the new configuration manager of .NET 6, they have this configuration manager instead of a builder. It also has I configuration builder. You would add things, but every time you call an add method on it, it will immediately add this thing to the special iList implementation that does more stuff. It will do use the provider to immediately build up the configuration data. So every add, you already have access to the configuration data, and you don't need to do the build anymore. Build is essentially, it does nothing anymore because everything has been done. All right, so I showed most of this. You could do a more basic approach. Saying, okay, this inside this configure that I have, where I would normally do use endpoints, I can still use endpoints because this I endpoint route builder is something that I can inject. If you didn't know, the configure, it has this I application builder, but everything that you add behind this that is injectable because you did the configure services before this gets injected. So if we want to get this I endpoint route builder, we can just use it and do the map get. So it's an easy way to combine the new stuff, but inside of the startup class. And if you want to keep the startup class, you might think, okay, I can do this. This is with IntelliSense, you can get this far and just say web host use startup. But as soon as you run it, you get this not supported exception. So you need to do a little bit more work, which is essentially wrapping things around. Instead of the startup class being used by some conventions and by reflection and calling into it, you can use the startup class to explicitly call the methods of configure services and configure. The final thing that I wanted to show you is integration and unit testing. There is some things that you need to keep in mind. if you do the anonymous lambdas, it's hard to unit test them. But if you do named methods, you can definitely use them in your unit tests. And let's just quickly go into a demo. All right, so what I did was the following. So to get access to it, you need to do this assembly internals visible to. I put it somewhere else, but that's one way to get into this thing, because all the code here is inside of an internal program class that they will build for you. To get access to it, you can also expose it by saying public partial. So you'll use the partial class and then change the access modifier to public. So at least you can get to it from a unit test. So this is a project, unit test project, and it's a regular test class. You can pick whatever you want. This is MS test, but X unit or N unit will do just as fine. If you want to check how returning a list works, well, you can start building this web host builder with a web application factory. So this is essentially hosting your application in memory. You can do configure services, because we want to replace the SQL Server with in memory. So you can still use these means, kind of old style, to get to it. But then finally, you use the web application factory to get an HTTP client that is pointing directly in memory to the implementation. So by calling it, we're not making a network call, but we're just doing this in memory, and you can verify the response. So that's like an integration test. You're hosting it and you're calling it, but it's in memory instead of over the network. Good for pipelines as well. And then if you want to check other results, so for example the get scores that we were exposing, here you can see that we can have the result, and the result is an I result, but we can say, okay, it should be of type OK, so a 200 status code. This returns a list of high scores, and we can inspect everything. But this OK is a new thing. As you can see, it's smallish, but it's HTTP results.OK. So it's a static method on a class. But by using this as a namespace at the top, you can just directly get to those. Now, let's see if we can run some of the tests here. So where did my test explorer go? All right, so the test ran. Let's try that again just to see the spinners. All right, so we saw that we could execute them both hosted and just by calling into the method. So that's a unit test and an integration test. Final remarks that I would like to make. If you look at the program CS now, it's getting really long. There's a lot of things in there, and if you put all your implementation there, it can get kind of messy. So you can use some bundling based on functionality. For example, we had this thing with the leaderboard. That's a functional area. It probably has some things like versioning, maybe some authorization, the endpoints that you want to expose, the dependency injection things that need to be registered, and you can use all these things to build on top of that. And so this thing here for leaderboard extensions, this is an extension class where you pick one of those types, like the endpoint route builder, and you put them into this single method that does all the mapping. So this is nicely hiding it away. So in your program CS, you would just say map leaderboards or map leaderboard API, whatever name you choose. And that does all the registering. And it can also be add leaderboard and use leaderboard if you want to do dependency injection things or middleware registration. And you can have your implementation there as well, nicely separated. So I put in some things on the .NET 8 preview. Some of them are already highlighted. You can read those in the slides. But I hope that from this session you saw that the web application hosting model and the way you implement routes, mapping, and create your APIs has significantly changed. This is how small it can be, but I hope that you now have an understanding of the things that are happening in between. That's it from my side for now.